It was August 1978. In a county hospital in Los Angeles, Charles Bronson sat beside a bed where a 67-year-old stuntman named Eddie Donovan was dying of lung cancer. Eddie had worked in Hollywood for 40 years, had doubled for stars in hundreds of films, had broken bones and risked his life so that actors could look heroic on screen. Now he was dying in a county hospital because he had no insurance, no savings, and no family to help with costs. Eddie had called Bronson 3 days earlier, apologizing for the intrusion, asking if Bronson might loan him a few $100s to help with immediate expenses. Bronson had driven to the hospital immediately, but he hadn't brought a loan. He'd brought something else. In his jacket pocket was an envelope containing a check for $25,000, enough to cover Eddie's remaining medical costs, pay off his debts, and leave something for a proper funeral. Bronson wasn't there to feel good about helping. He was there because Eddie had spent decades making actors look brave, and the least those actors could do was ensure Eddie didn't die broke and alone. What happened in that hospital room wasn't witnessed by anyone except the two men. But Eddie told his nurse before he died, and the nurse eventually told others, and the story spread quietly through the community of stunt performers who understood what Bronson had done. This is not a story about generosity or wealth, or even about Hollywood friendship. This is about remembering the people who made your career possible, honoring debts that aren't legally owed, and understanding that dignity in death matters as much as success in life. In 1978, Charles Bronson was 57 years old and earning unprecedented money for his films. He commanded over $1 million per picture, plus percentage points, making him one of the highest-paid actors in the world. But money hadn't changed his fundamental understanding of how Hollywood worked. He knew that actors received attention and wealth, while dozens of people who actually created the on-screen product remained invisible and underpaid. Stunt performers especially lived this reality. They risked their bodies to make stars look heroic, often working without proper safety measures or insurance, getting paid far less than the actors they doubled, and ending their careers with permanent injuries and no financial security. Eddie Donovan had been one of those men. He'd started stunt work in the early 1940s, had worked through Hollywood's golden age doing falls, fights, and vehicle stunts that frequently resulted in injury. He doubled for major stars when insurance and safety regulations barely existed, when directors pushed for dangerous stunts without concern for the men performing them, when one more take meant one more chance at permanent disability. Eddie had broken his back twice, shattered both legs, fractured his skull, and accumulated injuries that would have killed less tough men. He'd kept working because stunt work was all he knew, and because the alternative was poverty. Bronson had worked with Eddie multiple times over the year. Eddie had doubled for Bronson in several films where insurance requirements mandated a stunt performer handle particularly dangerous sequences. Bronson, who'd spent his childhood in coal mines and never forgot what manual labor actually cost, treated stunt performers with respect that wasn't universal among stars. He learned their names, thanked them directly, and insisted on safety measures that directors sometimes considered unnecessary delays. Eddie appreciated this treatment, but it was just professionalism, nothing that created particular closeness between them. They were colleagues, not friends. But Bronson remembered everyone who'd contributed to his success, kept a mental catalogue of debts, owed even when those debts weren't legal obligations. In early 1978, Eddie had been diagnosed with advanced lung cancer, likely caused by decades of breathing smoke from fire stunts and explosions before safety equipment became standard. The diagnosis came with grim prognosis: months to live, maybe a year, with aggressive treatment. But treatment required money. Eddie didn't have. He'd never made enough as a stuntman to save significant amounts. His body was too damaged from decades of injuries to work any other job. He had no family, divorced twice, no children, estranged from siblings. The small pension from the Stunt Performers Guild covered basic expenses, but nothing like cancer treatment in a private facility. Eddie ended up in county hospital, receiving basic care, but nothing that would extend his life significantly. The doctors were professional but overwhelmed. The facility was clean, but institutional. Eddie lay in a shared room with 3 other dying men. All of them poor, all of them receiving minimal care because that's what county hospitals provided. He'd accepted his situation with the stoicism that came from surviving 40 years of physical punishment. He would die broke in an institutional bed, and that was simply how things worked for men like him. Then the pain got worse, and the immediate expenses exceeded what his pension covered, and Eddie faced a choice: die in the county hospital or ask for help. Eddie made a list of people he'd worked with who might loan him money. The list was shorter than he'd hoped. Most stunt performers he'd known were in similar financial situations or had died already. The actors he'd doubled for were wealthy but distant, separated by the hierarchy that kept stars and stuntmen in different professional worlds. Finally, Eddie wrote down Charles Bronson's name. They'd worked together. Bronson had always been respectful. Maybe he'd loan a few $100s. Eddie called Bronson's agent, apologizing for the intrusion, explaining his situation, asking if Bronson might consider a small loan that Eddie would repay somehow, knowing he probably wouldn't live long enough to repay anything. The agent took the message. Eddie expected to hear nothing. Stars got dozens of such requests, and agents filtered them out to protect their clients from constant appeals for money. But 3 hours later, Bronson called Eddie directly at the hospital. His voice was quiet, concerned, without the performative sympathy people use when they're uncomfortable with illness. "Eddie, it's Charles Bronson. Your message reached me. Tell me what you need." Eddie, embarrassed, tried to minimize his situation. "Just a small loan. Couple $100 for immediate expenses. Would pay it back when he could." Bronson's response cut through the embarrassment. "Which hospital? What room number?" Eddie gave the information, confused. "I don't need you to come here, Charles. I just need... I'll be there tomorrow afternoon." Bronson hung up. The next afternoon, Bronson arrived at the county hospital alone. No publicist, no photographer, no entourage. He drove himself, parked in the visitor lot, walked through the institutional hallways until he found Eddie's room. Eddie was in the bed by the window, looking smaller than Bronson remembered, the cancer having already stolen significant weight. Bronson pulled a chair beside the bed and sat down without showing reaction to Eddie's deteriorated condition. "How are you feeling?" Eddie tried to smile. "Honestly, pretty terrible, but that's why I called. I need to borrow maybe $200 for medications they don't fully cover here. I know it's an imposition." Bronson pulled an envelope from his jacket and placed it on Eddie's bedside table. "That's not a loan." Eddie looked at the envelope, not understanding. "What is it?" $25,000. Check made out to you. Covers your medical costs. Pays off any debts you mentioned. Leaves something for afterward." Eddie stared at Bronson, processing words that didn't make sense. 25. "Charles, I can't accept that. That's too much. I just needed..." "You needed more than $200, Eddie. You needed someone to recognize that dying broke in a county hospital isn't acceptable for a man who spent 40 years making actors look brave. This isn't charity. This is the industry paying a debt it owes you." Eddie's eyes filled with tears. "I can't pay this back. I'm dying, Charles. I'll be gone in a few months." "It's not a loan," Bronson repeated. "You don't pay it back. You use it to die with dignity instead of dying broke. You've earned that." Eddie struggled to speak through emotion. "Why are you doing this? We weren't close friends. I just did stunt work on your films. I didn't. You risked your body so I could look like a hero on screen." Bronson interrupted, his voice carrying weight. "You and dozens of other stuntmen Most of you ended up broke or broken, or both. The actors who benefited from your work got rich and famous. That's not right, but it's how the system works. The least I can do is make sure you don't die in a county hospital worrying about money." They sat in silence for a moment. Eddie looked at the envelope, then at Bronson. "This is more kindness than anyone's shown me in 20 years. "It's not kindness," Bronson said. "It's recognition of debt owed. You made my career possible. This is inadequate payment for that." Eddie managed a weak laugh. "You're paying $25,000 for a few stunt doubles. That's more than adequate. You broke your back doing a fall I was supposed to take. That was 1969, Rider on the Rain. You spent 6 months recovering. I never thanked you properly. That was my job. It was my stunt that nearly paralyzed you. I've owed you since then. This is overdue payment, not charity." Bronson stood, preparing to leave. Eddie grabbed his hand. "Charles, I don't know what to say. This changes everything about how I die." "That's the point," Bronson said. "Use the money to get better care if you want. Stay here if you prefer. It's yours to decide. But you're not dying worried about money. Will you come back? I'd like to thank you properly when I'm feeling better." Bronson nodded. "I'll come back." They both understood Eddie wouldn't feel better, that this might be the last time they spoke, but the promise mattered anyway. Bronson visited Eddie twice more over the next 6 weeks. He brought books. Eddie mentioned wanting to read, brought decent food since hospital meals were inadequate, sat and talked about old films and stunts they'd worked on together. Eddie used the money to transfer to a private hospice facility where he received better pain management and more dignity than county hospital could provide. He died in September 1978, total and without financial stress, in a private room with windows overlooking a garden. His nurse was with him at the end. Eddie's last words to her included thanks for Bronson's generosity and a request. "Don't tell anyone what Charles did. He didn't do it for recognition." The nurse honored that request for years, but eventually, talking with other medical professionals about end-of-life dignity, she told the story without names. Someone recognized enough details to identify Bronson and Eddie. The story spread quietly through the stunt community, never making public news but becoming part of professional lore. Stunt performers told it to each other as example of the difference between actors who used stuntmen and actors who respected them. Eddie Donovan had died with dignity because Charles Bronson understood debts that weren't legally owed but were morally absolute. Bronson never discussed it publicly. When the story eventually reached entertainment journalists years later, they tried to ask Bronson for confirmation or details. His response was consistent. "Private matter between colleagues, not for discussion." His publicist, learning about it, suggested using it for positive publicity to counter Bronson's tough guy image. Bronson's response ended that suggestion. "No." Eddie asked for help privately. "I helped privately. That's where it stays." The refusal to publicize his generosity was as important as the generosity itself. Bronson understood that turning Eddie's death into publicity material would have violated everything the gesture meant. The stunt community never forgot. When Bronson died in 2003, the Stuntmen's Association included a tribute in their memorial service, noting that Bronson had been one of few major stars who consistently treated stunt performers with genuine respect, who remembered them by name, who insisted on proper safety measures even when directors resisted, and who quietly helped colleagues in need without seeking recognition. They didn't specify Eddie's story, honoring both men's privacy, but everyone in that room knew what was being referenced. Eddie Donovan's obituary in the trade papers was brief. Veteran stuntman, 67, died September 1978. No mention of cancer, no details about his final months, no reference to Bronson's help. Eddie had no family to preserve his memory, no legacy beyond the films where his work made actors look heroic without his name appearing in credits. But the stunt performers who knew his story preserved it as reminder that sometimes the people who contribute most to others' success end up with least to show for it. And that recognizing this injustice and responding to it, even in small ways, matters more than any amount of on-screen heroism. Years later, a documentary filmmaker researching stunt work in classic Hollywood tracked down the nurse who'd been with Eddie when he died. She confirmed the essential facts. Bronson had visited multiple times, had paid for Eddie's transfer to private hospice, had sat with him during his final weeks, and had done all of this without publicity or expectation of recognition. The filmmaker asked if he could interview Bronson about it. The nurse refused to provide contact information. Eddie asked that Charles not be bothered about this. "I'm honoring that request even though they're both gone now. The story matters, but their privacy matters more." Today, when people discuss Charles Bronson's career, they focus on his films, his box office success, his iconic tough guy roles. The entertainment industry remembers him as one of the most successful stars of the 1970s and 80s, but the stunt community remembers him differently. They remember him as someone who understood that the system was unjust, that stunt performers took risks for other people's glory, that dying broke after a career of service was wrong, even if it was common. They remember that Bronson, when given the chance to help, didn't offer a loan or minimal assistance. He gave enough to change how a man died, to provide dignity that the industry hadn't provided, to honor a debt that legally didn't exist but morally was absolute. The envelope containing $25,000 that Bronson placed on Eddie's bedside table wasn't charity, it was recognition. It said, "I know what you did, I know what it cost you. I know the system didn't compensate you fairly. This doesn't fix the system, but it acknowledges the debt I owe you." That acknowledgement, that recognition of worth, when society had decided Eddie was worthless, meant as much as the money. Eddie died, knowing that someone had seen him, had valued him, had understood that his decades of risk and pain had mattered. In a life that ended with cancer and poverty, that recognition of worth was the final gift Bronson could give, and he gave it privately, without performance, without expectation of anything except knowing he'd done what was right. If this story made you think about the people who contribute to others' success without receiving recognition, about debts that aren't legal but are morally absolute, consider subscribing. Have you ever helped someone knowing they couldn't repay you, doing it anyway because it was right?